Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that right.
Welcome back, everybody. All right, we're going to get started again. Welcome back, and thank you for sticking around for the whole afternoon. This panel, as you can see, is entitled Critical Competencies for the New Normal and How Best to Develop Them. I'll be moderating. My name's Helen Norton, and I'm Associate Dean here at the Law School. I'm going to be very brief with my introductions because you have more detailed introductions in the program. Immediately to my left is Deborah Cantrell, who's a tenured professor here and director of our clinical programs. Next to her is Mark Rolig, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Mass Mutual, and also who teaches on an adjunct basis every year here a class introducing students to the in-house practice of law. Next to him is Professor Neil Hamilton, who's a professor at the University of Thomas Law School and also director of the Halloran Center for Ethical Leadership in the Professions. And to the far left is Paul Lippy, founder and chief executive officer of Legal On-Ramps. So again, we're talking about competencies, and I'm going to define them broadly to mean capacities, qualities, skills, virtues, values, habits of mind, and behavior that legal professionals need, that legal employers value and want to find in the folks that they hire, so that the sets of competencies, qualities, capacities, et cetera, that we as law schools need to help our students develop and to help instill and facilitate and encourage in them. To start, I want to get a sense of the panel's sense of what and why with respect to competencies, and then how, meaning how do we actually help students develop them, and then how we screen for them. How do we know when we've actually been successful in developing them or helping students develop them, and how do employers know that they're hiring folks who've actually developed these competencies? So to start with the what and the why question, I'm going to start with Paul at the far end and then ask folks to work their way back in. If you could talk a little bit about what you identify as especially important competencies for law schools to develop in new lawyers, meaning the sorts of things that make new lawyers valuable as legal professionals, and why do you think those are the competencies? In other words, how can we have confidence that we're actually identifying the right competencies?
Wow, powerful microphone, powerful question. So let me maybe, since we've talked about the new normal before, let me give a little frame, because I think everybody else probably can answer the question specifically better than me. So first of all, just a massive shout out to Phil and everybody at CU who's been leading this conversation for 4, 5, 6 years, and the world has moved dramatically over that time. So I think Phil deserves an enormous amount of credit, and CU deserves an enormous amount of credit for what you're doing. And each of these events is another move down the path. I think you've got to sort of come to the conversation with sort of a basic, clear on what you have in your head. Since we're lawyers, we all like metaphors, so I'll offer a metaphor. So I'm not much of a photographer, but I'm aware that the iPhone now has powerful photography capability, and that photography capability spawned a whole set of adjacent markets and services, right? But if it were, say, 7 years ago, and you sort of said, am I going to be the iPhone or am I going to be a camera, right? So was I Kodak, was I Nikon? So if you're the iPhone, you have a world of expanding possibilities and a world in which, frankly, applying these design ideas is pretty fun because you're in a positive feedback loop. If you're Kodak and part of your reality is going to be preempted by new devices, new platforms, it's a much more difficult conversation. So, we could say there are 5 major players in the world of law. They're government, public service, private firms, law schools, and legal departments, whatever. So I certainly I don't have any opinion about government or public service. But by and large, the world of law firms is the world of the camera companies. And their world is going to get more difficult. That doesn't mean that Nikon doesn't continue to exist. That doesn't mean that there isn't a creation of adjacent industries. But the trends of the universe, and Jason, I think, said it really very well, the value that private lawyers are providing, and I've been at this for 30 years, I'm not making this up, is declining relative to most other fields, and that's a problem. But frankly, at the same time, I think we probably would all agree the value of the rule of law has never been higher, right? I mean, this is not going to be good for the GDP of the Ukraine, the kind of stuff that's happening there. So rule of law is super valuable. Private lawyers, because they've sort of stuck them, they've stayed thinking they were Nikon and didn't see the world of the iPhone coming, not so valuable. Law schools, as Phil and others have already said, and Bill Henderson said, law schools can choose. They can choose to become the iPhone and be more capacious institutionally, or they can say, well, it was fine being Nikon. Why do you despise photography? You're a fool. We'll just keep on being what we were. That's understandable, but it may not be the wisest choice. If you accept that little rubric, then what skills should law schools be teaching young lawyers? Well, probably, first of all, they can't simply keep asking law firms what skills, because the law firms are frankly not, are we like live here? They're not infinitely self-aware and sagacious. It's not to say that they lack capacity, but on the whole, they haven't, they keep saying things are going to bounce back. So the law school has to look more broadly to the Mark Roligs of the world, to the Jason Hendersons of the world, and see what more broadly is happening. Once you do that, honestly, that's like the easiest. Then it's the easiest thing in the world. It's going to be that design list of things. But you gotta kind of be clear on what your reality you're in. And I think many people are. The coalition, the willing is, but not yet a plurality. Certainly not yet a majority of folks in the world of law schools.
Well, just a little bit of history. So I'm just finishing my 40th year of teaching, so I'm bringing some historical perspective here. Just the general sense is that obviously the peer review professions have been slow to change, all of them, the medicine, the professorate, law, clergy. I mean, we're experts. We all think we're experts in the field, so we know what the person served needs. So that's been, I think, a basic theme in all these professions. Obviously, medicine's had to change very dramatically now in response to market, and now the legal side, legal profession side, the practicing side is changing, and finally, the professorate is starting to focus on the change. All my business friends have always thought it quite a mystery that legal education, higher ed in general, doesn't really do surveys of the people we're serving to see what they want. Although there are student evaluation of teaching, but in general, we're not surveying employers, for example, or clients ultimately to see what it is that they want and need. So that's how I got into the studies that should be in front of you. I got very involved with the Carnegie 5 studies of higher ed and the professions, and felt they gave great credit to legal education for, at least in 1 year, that first year, perhaps more progress on the fundamental doctrinal knowledge and the fundamental analytical skill needed for professional life of all the professions. So I hope we don't lose track of that. We haven't talked much about the foundation here. You do need legal knowledge, and you do need legal analysis. I think the question is that we're asking is there has to be something more. This would be the T-shaped lawyer, I think, that we've been talking about all day. And so I've been trying to convince my students, well, there are all these other skills that I think you should be aware of and try to develop. And it was a tough sell. A lot of the students aren't seeing that in the other messaging that's going on around them. That's why I did these studies of I started with just getting the associate evaluation forms of the 14 largest Minnesota firms, and then I looked around to see, well, what do we know, at least published, about evaluation of associates in other firms. I came up with 18 total that were published in 12 when I did this work. So there you see what's being assessed, which certainly supports a T-shaped lawyer, right? They're going far beyond just doctrinal knowledge and legal analysis and research. And then on the backside, my students then asked, well, yeah, but that's what they're assessing. What are they hiring to? So then I tried 4 studies. They're all Minnesota-based. So I did all 6 of our legal aid offices in Minnesota, regional legal aid, responded as to what are the critical competencies for hiring. 18 out of 37 county attorneys are folded into this. I already had the 14 largest firms, and then I got 23 out of a population of 87 small firms. Very difficult to get small firms to reply into this. I think one of the reasons is they're not used to such models. So they don't really it's not how they perhaps articulate what they're doing. They talk about fit, but they don't really break it into this. So here you get a sense, again, of a very much a T-shaped, where you'd need some depth in your doctrinal knowledge, certainly enough to pass the bar and to show a baseline credibility. The one mistake I made is in the small firm study, somehow Ranken Law School didn't include it. So I've got 3 studies where Ranken Law School was included, which obviously for the big firms is a threshold, right? They won't consider it unless you meet their threshold of rank, and the rank will vary depending on the rank of the law school. But once you get through that threshold, then they will look at the wider map as to what would be important for a hiring decision. So I really have, with this sort of data, I'm really able to get a lot more student attention to the fact that there's a much broader array of skill sets that we've been talking about all day long, and that they should look at how to develop themselves on these other skill sets. So.
Yeah, I sort of looked at the question maybe a little simplistically, which skill sets do I think are really valuable for attorneys or non-attorneys, because we are moving to more and more non-attorney professionals within our group that are working on the legal function at a company like MassMutual. Neil lists 20 there. I could have a long list, but I get it down to about 10. And only one of those is really the legal skills that are often taught at law school, which really go to really the providing sound counsel. The ones that I focus on at the end of the day, I mean, number one is get results. Hard work is interesting, but it's all about getting something accomplished for the client or for the company. So that's critical. Number two, and we'll probably talk about this more, is judgment. People say that to be a good lawyer, you have to have excellent judgment. And we've spent time among my team defining what judgment is, because I think you sort of got to define it before you can say whether somebody has it. And then we've spent time actually talking about whether it can be taught. And I have some thoughts on that. The other third one I would say is generally a strong work ethic. And by that, it doesn't mean sitting in the chair. As a matter of fact, we are very flexible as far as working arrangements. We think that allows us to, frankly, diversify our group much greater. And so it doesn't mean that you are just in the office, in the chair. As a matter of fact, I really don't care where you work. But it does mean that you're thinking about the issues that you're working on, that you are motivated, that you are taking initiative. Hope that's not me. Taking initiative, and you have a positive mental attitude. So I think that's really critical. Communication skills. We are in the business of communicating, and it's kind of a shame that in law school we don't learn some of the basics of how you communicate to clients, in particular corporate clients. We're generally taught, I think, in law school to learn how to talk to other lawyers or to judges. Well, I don't talk to other lawyers or judges much, but I talk to my clients a whole lot, and they don't like to talk the way lawyers like to talk. They don't want to hear, gee, we have a strong case here, or we probably can win this, or we might win this. Business people want to know, do you have a 25% chance, 50% chance? They want to be able to quantify the advice that we are giving them. They don't like the lawyer gobbledygook that we give them. They think in bullet points. They don't think in prose. And they want to be communicated to in bullet points. They want the recommendation right up front. They don't want the end of the memo. It's not the way we sort of lay it out with introduction and then the facts and then the law. And then, that's not the way they want it. They want it right up front. And if they have more questions, they'll get to us with those questions. So communication skills are absolutely critical. Strategic, and that's another one that's not taught in law school, which is really, how do you use your expertise to be strategic, to advance the interests of the company, so that you aren't just reacting when the phone call comes in, but you're using, whether it be legal, whether it be government relations, whether it be compliance, various things that fortunately or unfortunately I'm responsible for, how do you use those to advance the company? And I know when I was over at US West, probably Phil remembers this, that one of the things that they wanted to do for the fledgling new wireless carriers is to ensure that they were on an equal playing ground. And so they said that the big incumbent phone companies basically could not share their customer information with their new wireless business. Well, we sued the government and said that was a violation of our free speech rights. We won. We were able to share the information. So we used law strategically to advance the business as compared to just stepping back and responding to questions. Team focused. It's all about teams in this current world. We play different roles at different times. At times we're leaders, at times we're followers, at times we're individual contributors. We got to know how to play those different roles, and a lot of those roles we're playing in the context of a team. Sometimes we're leading a team, sometimes we're following or a team member, and sometimes we're truly going home and doing the work. But you really need the skills of being a team player and what it means to interact in a team. Other interesting ones are efficiently using resources. And you see this at law firms that are now outsourced, or not law firms, but you talk to people that talk about some of the outsourcing, or what Paul will recommend to talk about is where do we sort of decouple the services. So when I hire Quinn Emanuel to handle our RMBS litigation, they sure aren't doing the document reviewing. I'm not going to pay them to do that, and I'm sure not going to hire a first or second year associate to do it. So how do we decouple those services? And so effectively using the resources to get to the right answer is a skill set that, frankly, I think is absolutely critical. And tied into that is the use of technology. How to use technology. You know, we've got Practical Law Company, for example, is one of the resources we use, because frankly, I think legal research and sort of the law is becoming a bit of a commodity. It's the application that is really the value. And so how do you get to those various resources are really critical. Talent, whether it's in my role or frankly any role in law, how do you identify the right talent to surround yourself with those people? You're only as good as your team, and you're only as good as the people that you're working with. And so how do you identify those folks, and how do you then make them a part of the team? And then how do you develop them to the extent that they are part of your team? How do you develop them so they can be that much stronger? And one of the things I always say is I want to make my stars superstars as compared to take the people that are below average and make them average. And corporate America spends too much time in the latter of those two. And so we really got to focus on how we really take those stars and develop them to be superstars. And then frankly, how would we address performance issues? And then the last thing that I would say is, I don't know if it's become a buzzword in corporate America or everywhere, but engagement. Engaged employees, engaged professionals just perform much better. So how do you create an environment that really fosters engagement? How do you measure it to see if you're getting it? What are the elements of engagement? And if you look at, the Gallup does a poll on this every year, the companies that have engaged employees tremendously outperform other companies. And so how do you get that? And frankly, one of the ways you get it is, again, focusing on the people and focusing on a group of people where you really value everything they bring to the table. So diversity is a critical element to ensuring that you really get engagement, because you have to be both diverse and inclusive. You got to be diverse and inclusive on your teams, and you'll just get, back to the first point, better results. So those are the competencies that I'm sort of focusing on. And like I say, there's only one of those that needs to be traditionally taught in law school, which is to learn the sound legal advice.
I'm going to be very laser focused, and I'm going to pick one competency, and I'm going to pick a very, very old competency, and that of practical wisdom. Thank you, Aristotle. And I'm picking it and focusing on it because I think it reflects some key things that we've been talking about today, and reflects something really interesting about competencies. So competencies, I think if they're really good, aren't static. They change over time, they develop over time. The competency, what we think of as the competency, is as nimble as the people learning it. And if you think about practical wisdom, it isn't something that stays still. It is practical wisdom because of some normative choices you make about what the role of the lawyer is, where the lawyer is working, what the lawyer is trying to do, what a lawyer should be doing. Practical wisdom is because of the particularities of the question it's being asked to address. Is this a question about a client and a lawyer? Is this a question about a web of relationships? Is this a question that includes businesses in the relationships? Or is it just a relationship that's all about individual family members? So I think one of the reasons that practical wisdom is so key for me is because of the amount of work it does and the dynamism it allows to run through it. And it also is about formation, about key commitments we make to the profession that we're in, and those too can change over time. The core result, though, is exactly what Mark said. Good results. I mean, the end stage still is good results, good things, a better world. And so I think that's a piece that we have done, but I'd like us to be much more, often in law schools we have said practical wisdom means being professionally responsible, and I think that's a narrowing that is harmful and artificial, and so I'd like to encourage us to widen out what we understand our professional responsibilities to be as something that includes this very dynamic, very active, very engaged, very problem-solving, very creative, very innovative concept of being practically wise.
So that fit very closely to this metaphor, continuing metaphor of the T throughout the day's discussion. And for the most part, folks hopefully focused on the horizontal bar of the T. You know, and if we assume that those are valuable competencies, and I do assume that, then the next question is, if that's what we're supposed to be teaching, how do we do it? In the last panel, I think there was some anxiety and some skepticism that law school professors are actually well positioned to teach the competencies that are on the horizontal bar of the T, but there's some optimism as well. We do feel most confident when we're talking about the vertical bar of the T. We do feel most confident that we know how to teach legal analysis and critical thinking. And if we accept the premise, as I do, that we also have to be teaching the horizontal bar of the T, I'd like to invite each of you, starting with Deb, to pick one or two of these competencies, and I'll just remind folks of a few of them. I heard teamwork and collaboration, integrity, empathy, judgment, practical wisdom, work ethic, initiative, engagement. There are others. If you could just pick one or two and talk somewhat concretely about how law schools can help students develop them.
Mm-hmm. First, I want to say I'm much more hopeful than I think many people today have been that there are people now engaged in legal education who can do this, know how to do this, believe in doing this, are innovating or experimenting. And so I'm really, really hopeful. In part because law schools are diverse beasts. So think about one of the areas in the law school that I teach in, the clinical programs. How much work happens in clinical programs that asks our students to do every single thing that anybody's mentioned, I think, today during this conference. So I want to take, again, practical wisdom, because it's the competency I put on the table, and think about at least a process. In a way, it's picking up on George Kemble's idea of design theory. How do you understand what you're trying to do? And I think applying design theory is a great way to think this through. What do I think is involved in practical wisdom? Can I identify some component pieces and then translate them? In some of the work that I've done, I've identified component pieces of practical wisdom to include being empathetic, meaning being able to take multiple perspectives, being compassionate, which is being able to not only take those perspectives, but then show some sort of connection with any one of those perspectives to understand what is a scant or a skew that needs to be rectified, and to have a desire to work towards making positive change. And then two other pieces, being reflective and iterating on that process over and over and over and over again. Each of those component pieces you can translate into activities. You can make people do these things. You can ask people to take multiple perspectives by asking them to physically draw the web of relationships about the problem they're thinking about. All sorts of techniques, But it's this, what are the component pieces? How do you make them concrete? And how do you then make people do it over and over and over with reflection?
No surprise, I'll take the same one because I think it's so important. Whether it's practical wisdom or, as Neil called it, I think in his survey, good judgment or common sense, we've talked about it as really judgment. And one of the quotes I like is, good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment, as Will Rogers, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But we've spent time in a corporate setting. What is a good judgment? And we view that as making effective, productive decisions or actions in multidimensional settings that are aligned with the business objectives. So it really is making good decisions is what judgment is. And so then we go through what are the elements of a good decision, identifying what is important in any particular issue, get the appropriate information to understand the issue or problem, determine if there's a need for additional information. You know, you can overwork it, you can boil the ocean. Do you really need that, or do you have enough information? You got to integrate trends. You know, often in a particular issue, everybody has the same facts. It's how they put the different weight on the facts or how they see the trends that are occurring. To critically evaluate sort of the goals, the obstacles, and responses that you might get from the other side that you need to look at, and the risks of those and the costs and benefits of the various alternatives. You need to understand the impact on multiple constituencies. A classic on that, and I teach the class here to the students on Introduction to In-House Practice, and one of the things I teach them is the right legal answer is not always the right answer. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's the absolute wrong answer. And so you got to have the judgment to know when you're telling your client you can legally do this, but that is really probably the wrong thing to do, and you ought to be doing something else. You need to be able to listen to and sort of integrate conflicting views. You got to avoid your immediate impulses. You need to know what's socially right and wrong. I think that's really critical. And again, it goes to the point that not always the right legal answer is going to be the right answer from a societal point of view. You got to know when to escalate a decision, when you can make it yourself, and then you got to, frankly, your decision has to solve the problem. I've seen a lot of people come up with recommendations that don't solve the problem because, frankly, they can't be implemented. And then you got to balance the degree of uncertainty of the decision and ambiguity as compared to the certainty. So those factors, I think you say, gee, I think I could teach at least people to think through that sort of a way of dealing with a particular issue. And then what we do, back to answering your question directly, is we actually teach our lawyers to think about how to make good decisions. We bring in Connie Bagley, who's a professor at Yale, and she comes in and we use scenarios. We create some of them ourselves. She has created some that are fact patterns. And as a team, we sit, by team, it's probably 70 attorneys and paralegals sitting in the room looking at the various alternatives that we might take based upon the scenarios. And then we change the facts, we give another additional fact, and how does that change your thinking? So we're working together to get that experience and sort of thinking through how we would deal with a tough issue as a team, and we're making sort of thoughts to one another on, gee, that's a good idea, or I wouldn't do that for the following reason. So we're practicing judgment in a way that we aren't hurting our clients. We aren't doing what Will Rogers said, which is, frankly, we're doing it through bad judgment. We're doing it through training. So that's how we do it, and I think a similar approach through case studies, similar to what you get in a business school program would work at a law school.
Well, my suggestion comes right off yours, Mark, that I think we can learn a lot from other disciplines here. So, for example, on let's say you're choosing empathy. Actually, this is a discussion we had last night. Let's say you want to try care, empathy, very much client focus. Well, actually, medicine has been trying, the health professions have been really focused on this for some time. I'm blessed to be very close to Mayo Clinic, and Mayo has been investing phenomenal resources into this whole question of how do you do very deep care for the patient in teams. And they have a lot of assessments. So that's one. A lot of us are with med schools. A lot of us have med schools. That's a good place to start on that type of competency. Obviously, the business schools have a lot on case studies, teamwork. That one quote, I know it's when we've talked a lot about experience being critical and getting our students more and more experiences. I would say the experiences always lead to good judgment. And I would say at this stage of life, I know some very experienced people who don't seem to have very good judgment. But I think the key is Mark just said, you have to reflect into it. And I know we talked about this last night. You have to have feedback loops and reflect into it and learn from mistakes, preferably others' mistakes. But nonetheless, I have one quick thing. I think all of us in the room who are experimenting in this, we need to share what we're doing so that we can, especially with respect, let's say you're breaking out a competency or a capacity, as Deborah said, into its components. Well, what does that look like? And how would you assess? That's our next question. I mean, we should be sharing what we're learning on that. The firms, at least these larger firms, are breaking it out into stage levels on each of these capacities. I don't know if it's got a lot of validity to what they're doing, but they are doing it. And then finally, my own experience is every time I try a new experiment in some of these competencies that aren't sort of traditional, humility is a great virtue. And I couldn't agree more with one of our earlier speakers talked about sometimes you get some bad feedback. You take a few lumps when you're trying out something new, but then you let it sit on your heart a little bit, and then you try again, see what you can do. So you have to be resilient.
I'm up. Well, I feel like this is sort of profoundly bimodal panel in the sense that I think everything that everybody said is incredibly great, perfect, but everyone agrees, so it's not lively enough. But they're all right, especially Mark. So I can't disagree with anything. I think it's spot on. I'll go back up to 50,000 feet for a sec. So I had the opportunity. I was invited to speak to a bunch of federal judges a couple of weeks ago, and you know, the primary identification or a primary identification of the faculty and of the profession is with the role of a federal judge. And federal judges are beautiful, and the design in Article 3, it's all beautiful. But that whole design is about insulating people and basically giving a high degree of power based on a level of distance. It's a pretty non-market design, right? And that's great. But most of what professionals do in any setting is market-based, and there are feedback loops that exist. But much of the culture, and I totally agree with Deborah, I'm very optimistic because I just think feedback works, markets work, information works, right? Much of the culture of the profession and much of the culture of the faculty is designed to reduce feedback, reduce accountability, reduce all the things that lead to practical wisdom. So, you know, my view based on my experience of what's better is, you know, based on my experience, it's certainly, who knows if it's right, but if everybody's in a situation where they're exposed to more feedback, more learning, more practical wisdom, the profession will advance faster. And medicine, while it has obviously many of the same professional culture aspects of law, in terms of patient care, you know, the feedback loop is much more intense than it is in law. And the systems for assimilating feedback are frankly much more rigorous. So I think the one step is simply to de-insulate, to just accept that most of us are not federal judges, and the architecture, the design we have for federal judges is great for federal judges, but it doesn't actually carry over, particularly to the general counsel of a big insurance company. That's a different job, and we should think about the architecture of that job or any other job. Once we do that, we'll be in a faster cycle, more rigorous feedback. And then each of us can figure out what we want to take from that. And some of us will still have bad judgment. Maybe I still have bad judgment. But we'll at least get, you know, it'll whatever you said. It was a great aphorism. I should have written it down. But anyway, I'll look for the tweets.
And I think a key part really is this willingness to test hypotheses, not to create a hypothesis and say you already have the answer, but to genuinely create a hypothesis that you're willing to be proved right or wrong on, and that we're not particularly good at that piece. We just assume and then go find the data to support it. And we've got all sorts of methodological moves we could be making to be more considerate and scrutinize what we're doing more carefully.
We're always, I would say, as a profession, very guilty of category error, right? If somebody challenges how we assert the consequence of a hypothesis, we change the lens. So I'll give you what I think. So Sarbanes-Oxley, it either makes companies work better or it doesn't. There's no like meta thing of Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So we should evaluate, did it actually, in what instances do companies run better, or shareholders better off or not? Hardly anybody does that. We argue about the theory and people trot out Enron as if that proves something or doesn't prove something. But it's an actual thing, right? Dodd-Frank. Are banks lower risk and more effective in the economy or not? And that, so the sort of the T, or the vertical axis of the T, we're fabulous at. The reasoning, I mean, nobody else in an organization is going to read a document more than 3 pages. Nobody's ever going to write a document more than 3. We own that, right? Am I making this up? We own a huge stack there. But that stack is so much more valuable when it's complemented by the kinds of things that Mark and everybody else is talking about. Why wouldn't we develop those complementary skills? Unless we fantasize that we're really federal judges. And that's, I think, part of the problem, is that's kind of what's in a lot of our heads.
I have one last question for the panel, then I'm going to open it up to the audience. And it's not unrelated to Paul's last point about metrics, which is, all right, let's say we've identified the horizontal bar competencies that we're going to work on. Let's say that we have this plan for helping our students develop them. How can we actually be confident as law schools that we are helping our students develop these abstract, important qualities like integrity, like empathy, like judgment, like practical wisdom? How can our students prove it to employers? And how can employers screen for it effectively? What are we, and by we I mean both law schools and employers, doing right here, and what are we doing wrong? And Paul, I'll start with you.
You can't. That's a law professor question. You're hypothesizing some perfect future state, and then you're not going to get there. Just do a bunch of stuff, and it's an emergent truth. There's no one answer
well, let me ask
to that
you
question.
a personal question. How do you screen for it when you hire?
My experience is everybody you interview with who tells you how important integrity is turns out to be a con artist, right? So I don't know if Mark has different, but everybody I've ever told you, the most important value to me is integrity. So I don't know, some of these things are, I mean, they become apparent over time, but I don't think, well, I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm sure everybody's got a good list of how to answer, but I think that's not the right question. The question is, what are you doing tomorrow that's going to get you down that path? That question is so broad, it's a stopper, not a starter.
I'll make it more personal to you. You in our email exchange said that one of the first
Oh
competencies
God,
you
you're
identified.
trying to remember. I don't have to remember my email. That would really.
It was less than 3 pages.
Let me look it up here. Yeah.
Empathy, right?
Right.
Empathy. So if you value empathy, how do you screen for empathy?
I wouldn't say I'm competent to screen for it. I think you can observe it over time. I don't know how you would screen for it, honestly.
I think there are ways. So I think both Paul and Helen are right and are asking important questions, both of which need to be asked. So one is, I think we do need to push ourselves to try and make sure that what we say we're doing is doing what we're doing, which means we have to be thoughtful methodologists in figuring out what do we say we're doing, what do we think the indices of that are, and how are we going to capture that? And I think one of the flaws we often do here in the academy is say we'll just rely on some anecdotes. 2 students told me on my class ranking survey that they liked my class. Oh, good, I'm doing something right. Imperfect, not helpful measure. So on the empathy question, for example, in the legal, I tested myself this year. I wanted to teach empathy. I hypothesized about some things that I could do. The beginning of class, my students took an empathy survey that I adapted from a medical school empathy survey, middle of semester and end of the semester. Didn't have a large enough sample size to tell you something, but at least it was me trying to push myself to say, do I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing, and can I test myself? I don't know if it would make any difference at all if any of those students came to Paul and said, look at my JSE empathy score, Paul, hire me. I don't know at all, but it was interesting to reflect with the students.
Yeah, I mean, I raised the question because I'm honestly troubled by it, and I recognize it's a hard question, but I don't think it's an unfair and impossible question. It's a hard question because, on the one hand, employers, and Neil has surveyed them, and employers have talked to us here about what they value. They tell us what they value. When I've asked the
they
following
answer
question...
the survey, but they tell you what they value by who they actually hire. That's the only thing that matters, right?
Right. So then how do you know you're getting the thing you value? I mean, maybe the answer is I don't until they're on board.
Well, I don't think that's totally true. First of all, how can you screen for it? I mean, there are studies that can be done. We use PDI at the company, I guess it's Personnel Decisions International, that frankly does assessments of people. And you can find out a heck of a lot through a very structured assessment. Gallup, has the Strength Finder, and you can find out certain strengths there. And groups like General Counsel Roundtable actually have a business alignment program you can use to find out whether you're aligned with the business as far as the skills that are these competencies we're talking about. But to your question, as they walk in the door, how do we do it? I think Neil pointed out right away, the way the big firms do it in Minneapolis as far as intelligence is they hire from the big,
Great point.
the law schools that are the premier law schools. Because, you may have no judgment if you went to Harvard, but you're probably not stupid. And so they make that cut by doing it that way. So you can do that potentially for intelligence, but then for those other skills that I mentioned, first of all, we try to hire people that we know, people that we've actually worked with, so we already have a feel for those competencies. Are they team players? Do they have good judgment? So you can do that. Then when we do interview, we do it very structured. Our interviews are not, can you tell me why you left this job? Our interviews, we try to use hypotheticals or we try to use past examples because those are the best predictors of how somebody will work in your environment. So you give them a hypothetical that deals with an ethical decision. Or you say, gee, can you give me an example of when you were having to deal with a tough ethical decision? So now you're actually getting into those competencies and you can interview for them. And some companies, frankly, as I said earlier, and frankly, at my job, you're seeing a lot of it. If you want to be general counsel of a major company, get ready to be assessed before you show up because they are assessing us. And they are not going to make a mistake, and so they're going to be very careful.
Yeah.
So I'll be brief. How can legal employers hire better? I agree totally with Mark. I mean, a lot we could learn from larger companies have been doing much better at this. We're bringing in Bill's lawyer metrics team with 40 medium-sized firms in the Twin Cities to introduce behavioral interviewing and a much more structured interviewing approach. So I think that's a major stakeholder group to try to help do better in terms of interviewing approaches that are very much, as Mark just said. In terms of each of these competencies, I think we're going to be doing a lot of experimenting. You're going to need to do formative assessments for the students and find what works. I chose of that list in my professional responsibility required second year, third semester students. So I was focused on initiative, drive, dedication to professional development. So I did a survey of my students at the beginning of the semester. How many of you actually have a plan for employment from where you stand now to get a job? Well, the results were surprisingly low. Very, very few actually had a plan for employment. If you actually ask how many of you have a written plan for employment, none of my 76 students had a written plan for employment of any sort. So I required them to do 7 hours on a roadmap for employment, structured plan into employment, and then I assigned each of them a veteran coach from the bar to go over the plan from whatever area of practice the student thought he or she was going into. So they were getting feedback. So then at the end of the semester they all moved to having a plan for employment, number one. That was dramatic. But in terms of I got also back from the coaches that they were telling me to what degree the student had actually done it or not. So I thought we were getting some sort of a metric there on whether it was working. There's lots of fine-tuning to be done, but I'm just saying I think each of us has to experiment, see what we could do into one of these competencies.
Yeah, to Neil's point, I probably shouldn't give away my secrets, but every interview I do, one of my questions is, can you give me an example of something you saw that was totally outside your area of responsibility, it was broken, and you fixed it? Because I'm looking for just that person. I'm looking for the person that sees something that's broken and is going to go out and take the initiative to fix it.
Right.
So I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, and I believe I'm going to.
Oh, geez.
Can folks identify themselves when they ask questions too?
Is that a student
Yeah,
hand?
I love Paul's suggestion. Would folks be willing to tell us who you are when you ask your question?
Is there a student first who has a question?
If Katz had his Google Glass on, he'd be able to do the facial recognition, but since he's not wearing it, we need you to tell us.
G, do you have a question?
I
You
always
got the
have a
mic.
question.
Don't we have to start with the student? Yeah.
I guess one of the things that when I was just listening that I thought about was the idea when you said about empathy.
Whom are you gesturing at? Sorry.
The professor from Minnesota.
Hamilton, okay.
Excuse me, I poor eyesight. I used to live in Minnesota. And so I guess one of the things I thought about was this idea of empathy and measuring that. And when you gave the example, like, what would you say, or when's the last time that you saw something and changed it? Now I thought, if this was my 5th or 6th interview, if I had a wife or kid at home, it doesn't matter if I've changed anything or not. I'm going to come up with something to tell you to try to demonstrate that quality because I know that's what you want to hear. And so it made me think about, just like on the personality things, just the ability to game. If you're interviewing lawyers, you're interviewing really smart people that have thought on their feet, that are creative. And so it made me just wonder about, is that
But
even-
ultimately, the game is reality, right? If you can game that question well enough, you can also execute it, right? So you're kind of positing a false dichotomy.
I can't say I would
Some of us
necessarily
might
agree with
disagree a
that.
little bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think, so if I understand, you're saying a very smart law student will quickly game into a question about empathy? Am I getting the question right? You
yeah.
can game that question.
I think so.
And I think, absolutely, but I suppose you would also be asking specific questions. The interviewer, if you're using a behavioral interviewing, is asking very specific questions about how was empathy grown? How were you growing your empathy? And I assume your references would have to back you up on that. I mean, there are ways we could check to see whether the people you've worked with would vouch for that.
Sure, and I'm
Yeah.
certainly not disagreeing with that.
Yeah.
It just, when listening to the conversation about metrics and how you measure, and that's just a thought that came to my mind.
no, it's a
And-
very
People
good
will always
question.
game the metrics by definition, right? In any system, I mean, look at how U.S. News has impacted higher ed, right? So you have to do your best to come up with the best possible metrics, and you have to be sensitive to the gaming that's going on. But the alternative is to have no metrics, which generally would lead to less rigor. I mean, bad metrics are not good, but no metrics are rarely an optimal situation.
Another question.
And you've got somebody right behind you, G, too, who had his hand
One
up.
of my students.
Oh, good.
He's going to
got a question.
He's going to ask me the tough
Mark-
question.
Mark
Why
has
did you
a
get a bad
question.
grade?
Hi, my name is Stu. My question is for you, Paul, and Mr. Lippy. And I
Paul, it's
apologize. I know what it's like to be asked a hard question by Dean Norton, so it's kind of rough.
Yeah, I wasn't ready for that
But
one.
aren't there somewhat other ways to get knowledge about a person besides just interviewing? I mean, I know certain large companies will do where they have to play games with each other,
Sure.
and you can get an idea of how they interact with each other without them necessarily knowing or responding in a way that's, as you say, like rehearsed.
Yeah, well, I would, sure. I mean, well, first of all, I think the sophisticated companies like Mass Mutual, but lots and lots of places, the military, I mean, they're very rigorous about assessing people, and most organizations wouldn't look as the interview as the primary thing. I actually have a slightly different perspective, consistent with Deborah. I'm really optimistic. I think 90% of the people that graduate from law school, if they're put in the right context, will become T-shaped lawyers. So I'm not that into screening people out and credentialing. I'm into, if you want to try, I think you can succeed. So if you have one job to put somebody in, you're going to interview rigorously. But I would go to the other extreme, is create as many opportunities for people to acquire and demonstrate those T-shaped skills, and I think most people will do great.
Next question.
Hi, excuse me, Carol Chomsky from Minnesota. So I guess my perspective, I have this sort of hopeful perspective as well. I think a lot of the things, various people said, traditionally we don't do this kind of thing, but then went on to say exactly how you are teaching different kinds of competencies. And I think I see, not across the board, not for every student, not in every class, but I see a lot of these competencies, capacities being addressed. What we haven't done is talk about that's what's going on. And if we proceed as actually we'll have to do more with new accreditation standards and having to define learning outcomes, because really what you're talking about in another guise is learning outcomes. If we start to talk about what we're doing and we list things, we can then, that alone helps. We identify where we are doing it piecemeal in individual courses, aspects of it. And the other thing I wanted to say was not all of these things have to happen in classes. The undergraduate learning outcomes at the University of Minnesota are defined, and then, yes, some of them are learned in classes, but there are a lot of opportunities. The student, I forget what the name of that branch is at the university, but it's basically student organizations and activities. There are lots of opportunities to develop those as well, and students can self-assess how they're doing on developing some of these capacities because they see themselves doing activities that they can identify are on the list. So I'm more hopeful once we start to talk about it that we actually are doing a lot and that we'll do more once we start to identify them.
I would totally agree with you. I think that, people, for example, that would say leadership's innate, maybe it was for Napoleon, but I think that a lot can be taught and a lot can be practiced. And back to the empathy, frankly, when I took one job, I was not viewed as very empathetic. So we talked about some things I could do to create a different image. Stopping at Safeway every Friday and picking up those donuts and carrying them into the office changed the perception of me among the group incredibly. And so there are things that you can do. And it's not that you're just trying to trick the system, but you are actually trying to show the team, for an introvert like me, that there is another side to me. And so you've got, I totally agree with you. I think when you break down the competencies and then you say, how can we work on teaching these and what do they look like when we see them and how do we reward them, I think it can be done.
Hi, Mindy Foreman, Kauffman Foundation, and forgive me, I have no...
Whatever you want, the answer is we'll do it. What's the check?
I have no law school background. I'm not a lawyer, but I did go to grad school. And my question sort of to teaching to the horizontal part of the T, have some of the law schools looked at, instead of bringing in adjuncts, working interdepartmentally or working across different schools and,
Sure.
looking at the business school for, teaching Excel and PowerPoint and presentation skills, or, whatever the specific desired skill is, using the people that you already have who are already on payroll, already on staff, maybe the law schools choosing some of the best, we think these are the key ones that our students should really know, and incorporating those into some kind of program.
Absolutely. I think that's happening at a lot of places. And I think what's been fun for me is to see some of the unexpected pairings. So the theater school that comes in and you talk about body language and you practice body language, you practice the use of the pause. Those pairings that once I just said it, of course you were like, oh, of course, it's obvious, but it may not be so obvious. I think those are fun. And really part of it too, that cross-disciplinary work is fun work too, so it enlivens things in an interesting way.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, my name is Anita Monaghan. I am not in academia. I've been a practicing lawyer for 30 years, and about half outside and half inside as general counsel and some other jobs. And what I find, I kind of agree with you, Deborah, and Mark, that a lot of these skills are things that I looked for when I was hiring lawyers and also when I was hiring outside counsel to do some things for me, and what I tried to talk to young lawyers about. But what I find is in-house departments and in-house lawyers seem to embody these skills much more so than outside lawyers. The people that were the most effective to me as counselors were people who understood my business and understood that the strictly legal thing is not always the thing that's going to work. You know, I'm not saying unlegal or illegal, but just to say, look, what's the practical application of this? And I guess I would, this is a comment, I would just say I think the schools need to work on providing those skills, but also having, inculcating in those students the strength to know that you're going to go into law firms that don't have these values necessarily, and even not a value, but they don't even understand how it works. So they got to learn how to say, look, this is something that clients value and clients expect to have, and it's got to be beyond just knowing the law and being worried about whether you're going to commit malpractice. You know, I always felt if I went back out into being outside counsel, I'd be a much better lawyer and a much better counselor.
You know, it's interesting because I totally agree with you, and I think part of it, and of course you've seen it part of your various roles. One of the challenges that law firms have is that generally companies have been buying hours. They have not been buying results.
Right.
And I think you're seeing a change in that, and it's changing pretty quickly. And as we start to really want results as compared to hours, then we're going to see all these other competencies roll through. But if we're just buying hours, frankly, you don't have to be a team player. You don't have to be innovative. You just have to do the work and build the hours, and you know, you move up to be a partner. So I think that will change, though.
Yeah, just maybe we're out of time. So just I mean, if you look at where we were to what Mark was saying a minute ago, a key skill is discernment of the trend, right? If you compare where we are to I mean, you either think the direction that we broadly think are going is better or you don't. If you don't think it's better, then you don't think it's better. If you think it's better, we've made material amount of progress in the last 4 years. And whether that progress is linear or beginning to be exponential is, you know, interesting question. But we're radically ahead of where we were 4 years ago. We'll be radically down the path 4 years from now. That doesn't mean that there aren't many, many structural barriers to change that will continue to assert themselves. But if this direction is better, it will happen. And it is indeed happening. So I agree there's tremendous room for optimism. And if you were to play back any of these meetings 4 years ago, you'd feel wildly positive about the progress that's been made.
Please join me in thanking
thank
this
you.
very thoughtful panel.
So we're not taking a formal break. There's a short adjustment process as we get our final panel teams up here. Yes, it's great to have. Thank you. We're in the process as legal innovators, but we're now calling the development of T-shaped lawyers. And with sort of inspiration from some of the experimentation before us, let me call an audible for what will be my first question, which is the frame of training T-shaped lawyers can be internalized in different ways. One classic way would be we have to think both horizontals and verticals on the competency or capability perspective. Another would be we have to get outside of the traditional legal box and expand the relevant domains of knowledge in different ways, you know, including domain knowledge from other disciplines.
I'm going to run out and check. Your Mass Mutual friend.
Mark?
Left his cell phone here.
Oh. Can you get Mark Rolig? Thank you. Mark Rolig, we want to make sure to get Mark at a cell phone.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt that.
No, it's okay. No, Mark.
Good.
So, as Mark said, T-shaped lawyers are an important framework to think about. I want to ask each of our deans, each of whom has, you know, a really tremendous background, two of whom have been at more than one school, all of whom would be thriving in areas outside of being a law dean. Does this idea resonate of T-shaped lawyers? What does it mean to you, and how does that affect how law school innovation going forward should look? Dan, you want to take a whack at this first?
Well, it's like the old saying, I don't know if it's apocryphal, about somebody says, do you believe in immersion baptism? I said, believe in it, I've seen it happen. Yes, certainly T-shaped lawyering. It's not man bites dog. I mean, it's an innovation and it's a wonderful phrase, and that is not to say that everybody's doing it. What would you like me to do? Okay. I don't have a tie. So I'm gonna clip it on my... How about that?
Turn it around.
Okay. Great, thanks. And it's a wonderful phrase to capture it. I think the interesting thing to me is on the horizontal bar, because breadth, I mean, we can have a sense of what depth means, right? And we have 100+ years of a head start in depth. When we talk about breadth, though, it could mean a number of different things. At my law school and many other law schools, the emphasis, indeed the priority on interdisciplinary education within the law school by bringing in this not too small army of folks who have substantial training, usually but not always, in the social sciences, to an increasing extent in technology, provides our students with on-the-ground depth that's really quite remarkable. The availability, again, at my school and many other schools, of joint initiatives, the very last question of the last panel, of being able to build bridges across the campus. I have the extraordinary luxury and privilege of being able to work and integrate with the Kellogg School of Management, one of the great business schools in the world. And whether it's a formal affiliation like JD/MBA, which really gets at the breadth of that T, or it's a variety of coursework and modalities of education, that's an enormous advantage. So interdisciplinary experience is a big part of that T. I think that just could go on, but just one point of emphasis that I would regard as quite central, and again, it came up in the last panel as well, is teaching our students to understand the work of our clients. In our case, a not substantial number of graduates of our law school go on to become clients right away. They found startup companies. They go to the two coasts or stay in Chicago and become entrepreneurs. They go work for big corporations or not so big corporations. So they are right off the ground clients. Business folks. Some go to GC's offices. And again, that story can be told about a number of schools, including this one. That opportunity to be in the shoes and in the minds of folks who are going to engage lawyers and help reinvent our profession, I would put at the top of the list of the kinds of skills that are at that horizontal bar of the T. That has been slow in coming, but I think the growth of client-based legal education, client-centric legal education, and the nexus between what really a trio, what in-house counsel do, what the lawyers who represent the clients do, and what the folks who are in or aspire to be in the C-suite, right, do in that is probably the key part of the breadth that we can and in many instances do provide in our law schools. That's an optimistic rendering.
Dan is the president of the American Association of Law Schools, so it's a good thing he's an optimist. Thank you for your work with him, Dan. Trish?
Let me take a little bit of a different twist without denying anything that anybody has said or disagreeing with anything anybody has said about the T. But let me make it a little bit more subtle and sophisticated. Lawyers have always been thought of as being exceptionally quick studies. And being a good lawyer has always meant that you have the depth of legal knowledge and you can pick up across the T really quickly. And really good lawyers are really exceptionally good at that and have always thought of themselves as being good at that. Things that are included across the spectrum of that cross have, I think, been broadened. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about today represents an increase of numbers of things. Welcome, Kelly. Numbers of different kinds of subjects which we didn't properly value before. We didn't pay nearly as much attention to lots and lots of subjects that are important in thinking hard about business, project management for one such thing. We certainly didn't think about the technical subjects. We certainly didn't think about informatics. We certainly didn't think about science. We certainly didn't think very much about those things. And I think now we are. So I think that T at the top, or the cross, is getting broader and longer and richer. That being said, I am an old-fashioned person who really believes that in many different fields there should be two depths that are coming down. And that one of the problems with law traditionally has been that lawyers have had great depth of legal knowledge, but not great depth of something else. And I was probably the first woman in the country to do a joint JD and PhD in philosophy, and that was 100 years ago. And that was a very weird thing at that point. You couldn't find schools that would allow you to do it, and you had to do both things simultaneously. You got no joint credit because law schools just weren't designed to do that. And now what I think is law schools have become much more wonderfully agreeable to that. Universities generally have been much more agreeable to doing joint degrees, which then will provide you with depth in another subject. And you can do that with a serious undergraduate education. Somebody wants to be a patent lawyer, it's a really good thing if they actually know some science or some engineering. And it's a seriously good kind of depth. So I think it's really multiple vertical lines that we're seeing, and a longer horizontal line.
So, Kelly, we welcome you to the panel. Thank you very much. Kelly Teskey, also dean at two different law schools. Trish, you would not have guessed she went in to be a tax lawyer after getting a JD, PhD in philosophy. And like someone adverted to, do lawyers ever who are in the academy take a year off and go into practice? Yes, she's done that too after her first deanship. Nick Allard had been in practice for a very long time and has come into this world of the academy. So you are well situated to answer this question. When you think about successful lawyers and this T-shaped idea, does it resonate with you?
No. I'm very suspicious. I mean, if it works for you, use the phrase, but I think it's already a cliche growing a beard. We get wearied of it. Just like, I noticed we skipped over experiential today. We didn't really dig into that, thank goodness. That's a term that I think is losing some of its luster. And I don't think it's particularly helpful in analyzing the situation. But I should start off by saying, before I sound crabby, what a joy it is to be here and be back in because come back to see my old friends here. Been at the Silicon Flatirons conferences many times, and enjoyed having Brad's outstanding students from here visit us at my law firm in Washington. And Dale Hatfield is bouncing around, I know, here someplace. Paul Ohm's work on privacy is something I follow very closely and use both in my course. that I'm teaching, but also in practice. I hope that doesn't horrify you. We should talk about General Mills, what they're doing in terms of trying to use their privacy statement to get people to waive their rights. It's very interesting. Taking a step back, I'm very optimistic about the future of legal education, and you have to take that with a grain of salt because, obviously I don't know what I'm talking about. When I came into this job, there was very little, there was a lot that I didn't know and even more that I didn't suspect. But I have great confidence because of the knowledge and talent and ability of everybody in the country that is talking about all these issues. And I can't believe that all the people that have worked and dedicated their lives to legal education aren't going to get this right and make improvements. The second thing is I really believe that the role of law in America is the secret sauce to how this republic has endured, and it's both the engine of economic growth. It's what Russia doesn't have. It's why Russia can't go beyond exploiting its natural wealth and then having a disproportionate number of people benefit from that. It's also what's protected our ability to observe civil liberties and have them evolve. And so lawyers are essential and they will remain so, and educating prepare a lawyer was going to make the case. And I see that a lot of these changes in what we're doing already in many different ways in many different law schools is very adaptive, but it's also good. And the disruption from technology and globalism and all the other stuff is a big positive. So, for example, the things that when you hear unbundling, we're not going to hire somebody to do proofreading. We're not going to hire an associate to go sit in a hearing in the Senate for Allard to come by 5 hours later. They're just not going to do that. Well, that's all a good thing. But what now is, and this is the good news for law students, and it's actually good news for the academy have to prepare people. And I don't know whether you call it T-shape or experiential, whatever it is, but what clients will pay for a lawyer to do and what they need are the 3 A's, and that's analysis, advice, and advocacy. And that is work worth doing. And so I'm very optimistic. I think the mission and the cause of getting it right is important, and I think that the work and what our students will be prepared for, and also ironically, that's both a combination of not just practical training, but scholarly critical thinking to be able to answer, as we heard in the first session, problems that no one's ever seen before that we can't anticipate, to be able to think through things, but then to be a successful person in analyzing, communicating that to the client, providing advice with judgment, and being an advocate. So that's a roundabout answer to your question, but I don't like tea.
So in terms of ways to think about and measure experiments, let me get Kelly involved. A lot of law schools are doing different experiments to adapt to our changing world and the changing world of practice. Could you talk about a couple that you've done, how you came up with them, and how you're measuring them to see if they're successful?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Bill, it's nice to be here. Sorry that things were late today. It's good to be with everybody. Let me say, first of all, that one of the questions that I think almost comes before that is creating within your law school an environment where you can experiment and you can have a climate that encourages innovation. And I want to just mention a couple things there before I give specifics.
Great.
It, of course, is with most things, starts with, I think, the leadership of the school. And, of course, the dean has a large role to play with that. But one of the things that I know I'm so pleased about right now at the University of Washington is that it's a very innovative time. It's a time when people are trying a lot of things, not afraid that everything has to work, that some things might fall away and some things we would stick with. And I've thought a lot about what has created that. Where's the spirit? And I think it's really from two key places, and so I want to mention those. One is in the faculty themselves. To have a group of faculty members, or at least a core nucleus, who are interested in new things and really trying them. But as we all know, that's often not enough, because if people have ideas and they want to try things, if the climate's not there where they feel they can do that, it stops pretty quickly. And so one of the things that I've been just so pleased about, and I want to mention in particular because she's here, is my associate dean, Pat Kusler, is here, who's a JD MD and a person who believes in trying out a lot of things. And so within the dean's office, especially in that core academic dean role, I think first and foremost there has to be a person there who's really willing to say,
let's not always just do things the same way. Let's try new things, and here's how we can help you think about that. And just having that mindset and that person who can help get resources, help connect people to, similar initiatives, that's just a really key role in a law school. And I've seen it work and I've seen it not, and I think that's where the nucleus really starts. So let me mention a couple things that I think that would be of interest to the group. And one is that, we're all thinking a lot about the fact that even though there's this idea that there are too many lawyers, there's certainly a huge access to justice gap within our society. And every day, fewer people can afford lawyers and fewer people are being served, and that gap gets ever wider, all the while we're having these conversations about legal education. And so one of the things Washington State's done, and I think it was the first state in the country, is it came up with what's called an LLLT, which is a limited license legal technician. Quite a mouthful, but it basically permits a person to get a license in a limited area of practice and then to help clients within that specific area. The first area Washington chose was family law because they thought there were just so many pro ses, so much need for help. I would imagine that even 5 years ago, the idea that the University of Washington would have created a curriculum for such a program would have been almost unthinkable. I think people would have been, oh no, we're a major public research university, we don't do that. We, in very short order, mounted a wonderful start at this in terms of curriculum to help the bar, and it's in partnership with the Bar Association, and so we have a very close relationship with them. They look to us. Our support on it was conditioned on the fact that it had to be good quality education. They said, okay, well then put your effort where your mouth is and come up with that curriculum. And so I think that's one area that's been really interesting to see. And it's not clear yet to me that it's going to flourish, but I think it's also opened our school up to understanding more thoroughly that access to justice gap. And then that spurred other areas where I think we've been able to help work to close that gap.
Dan Katz gave a shout out to that earlier, Kelly. That's a great one. Trish, how about you?
Well,
I would say that the most interesting, innovative thing that we have done, which has gotten a lot of attention internationally, is something called Law Without Walls. And Law Without Walls, which just had it just finished its 4th year, is a part virtual, part and all synchronous, and part in person collaboration now course, basically, between 29 law and business schools around the world, ranging in this country from Harvard Law School and Stanford Law School and Wharton and our school and Bill's School, Indiana Law School, and then University College London, Peking Transnational Law School, National Law School of India, University of Sydney, I can go on and on, Latin America, Iceland, South Africa. All of these schools are involved, and it was created by, and this goes back to an earlier kind of conversation that people had, by an untenured faculty member at our school, Michelle DeStefano, and it was a very risky thing. I supported her completely. I put a lot of resources into it. It's now making money. It makes money because, not because the schools have to pay to participate, but because Evershed's global law firm and Barclays Bank in London support it. And it ties in with what she calls lots of newspeak, but it's all this collaborative. It's very much a Stanford D School kind of project where students in teams from these schools work together on solving problems that they articulate, and then they all come together in Miami, which they did just last week, and it's an event. Bill's been there. It's an extraordinary event, actually, and we have virtual judges, venture capitalists, lawyers, academics. It's just an amazing, amazing thing, and one of the most interesting features now has been the role of Eversheds. Eversheds, which is a British global law firm, doesn't have an American office, but they every year, why they pay us is that they send 14 of their associates from their global offices and 14 people from general counsel's offices in their major global clients who participate with the students in solving the problems, articulating the problems, and coming up with these projects of worth, some of which have now been funded and are really quite remarkable. And Barclays is involved because Barclays was an Eversheds client last year, liked it so much that if you want to, Eversheds funds the first clients, but if you want to continue to participate, you, Barclays, pay. And it's become scalable, and we've now created an LWOW-X, which is entirely virtual, that can be scaled to hundreds and hundreds of participants, and students get credit in all these schools, and no money changes hands behind the school. So it goes to the question the young woman who's left asked about a collaborative thing between schools. It goes to the question about a risk being taken by an untenured faculty member who I'm happy to say got tenure last week. And it goes to the question of sort of innovation and what we can do. So it's something I'm really excited about.
Dan?
So reminded of the comment in the last session about folks increasingly learning in bullet points rather than prose. Let me give you the bullet points. In any given year, first about the input of students. In any given year, 90 to 95% of the entering students at Northwestern Law School have substantial work experience before they come here. Now, to be sure, the direction that law schools generally are moving is in that direction, but we've been at the forefront for that for quite some time. It is not unusual in business schools, to be sure, but in law school it's been quite unusual. So essentially, nearly every one of our law students has experience. And when I say experience, the average is 2+ years. They've been in the private sector, in corporations, they've worked in startup companies, some gone for Teach for America. But the diversity and plethora of experiences that the students have, we are told by employers who run the gamut that it makes a meaningful difference. We interview nearly every student who applies to the law school, so we have a sense of their social skills. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we do not look at numerical criteria and that we're not as rankings chased as the next guy. But I will tell you that the combination of our work experience de facto requirement, along with our interviewing of students, gives us a leg up and a measure in to those students. And although in a selfish world I would say I wish we could patent that idea, of course we can't. I think that's the trend in law schools, and law schools will move in that direction. With respect to what we call practice proficiencies, or if you prefer competencies or capabilities, however you want to measure it, two jump out that are particularly salient and important innovations. One is the emphasis we put on teamwork. We look at that not only in admissions, but we put an enormous amount of premium and freight on that, taking a page from the playbook of business schools to be sure, but put a very significant emphasis on teamwork in the classes. We have flipped classes, we have the picture from the first session about tables on rollers. All of that is a key element. We put a significant emphasis on quantitative skills, what we've come to be calling in recent weeks a digital portfolio, a requirement that students graduate from Northwestern with a substantial digital portfolio. I was wishing Dan Katz would ask in his panel for a show of hands about specific technology initiatives. We I think, will be the first law school, well, Michigan State may be the first law school. If so, we'll be the second to require a coding class of all of our students. We're very much moving. All of our law students, we're going to require it at Northwestern, and we're going to require, this I'm less optimistic about. If we don't require it, we will provide substantial coursework in legal analytics. We want every one of our law students to understand big data, even if they won't be the producers of big data, how it marries and manages onto law, and how that will make a significant change in the marketplace. So teamwork, quantitative skills. The last thing I want to mention is we've made a big wager on what I've come to call the law-business technology interface. The integration of law and business skills, for which our law school, a number of law schools have been well known, is all fine and good, but the integration of those kinds of courses with technology is a key emphasis of our law school going forward. So we've developed a new master's program. That's not news, but what's news is our master's program that is admitting a student cohort for the fall is geared towards scientists, engineers, and medical professionals who will come and receive a one-year law degree or a part-time law degree in a year and a half to give them not to take ordinary law classes. It's cost me a hell of a lot of money, let me tell you. Standalone courses taught by a combination of full-time faculty, new faculty, and adjunct faculty who will give scientists, engineers, and medical professionals exposure to entrepreneurship, intellectual property, legal analytics, and the kind of skills that will help them in the marketplace. Lastly, I'll mention is what we call, and you can look it up on our website, the university's website, an initiative called NUvention. Get it? NUvention. It's a consortium of students from 4 departments: the law school, Kellogg School of Management, McCormick School of Engineering, and the Feinberg School of Medicine. They work together in an incubator type setting to help in medical devices, environmental sustainability, a variety of different areas. They create a product. They bring that product to market. They've won business competitions. This is the future, as far as I'm concerned, is integrating the law students in not necessarily just the high technology sector, but the work they will do alongside folks in business, in technology, in medicine, to really help move the ball forward in a substantial way. So those are some examples.
So Nick, I want to move on, and again, you're a great person to start with because you've had the benefit recently of hiring, supervising, promoting recent law grads and lawyers. We're now thinking harder than ever before about what makes for a successful law school graduate. And the question I have for you is, how would you answer that question, and how does the answer to that question drive and affect what you're doing at Brooklyn?
Well, jobs has been a huge priority for us, and I'm sure it is for every law school. I'm not that surprised that Trish went from philosophy to tax. I think that practice area is very metaphysical. And Trish, the only thing I remember from my philosophy studies back in the medieval times was that if I'm alone in the woods and I say something and Marla's not there, I'm still wrong. So that's all I took away from it.
Tax lawyers and philosophers are both good at counterexamples.
There you are. So with respect to jobs, I heard something this morning. There a lot of what Dean Moffat said really, just across the board, rang true with me. But one of the things he was talking about was about how unhappy people are. And if you're not enthusiastic about your work and you're not passionate for it, if you're not engaged, you're not going to be successful, right? So this goes back to something else, but I won't. It could be an entire day-long session. In fact, it's the big elephant that was not mentioned in this room, which is finances and the cost of education. But if our graduates are bearing crushing debt, they cannot feel free to choose jobs other than to try to relieve that debt. They can't go into fields that most interest them. They can't take a chance on a job. All they can do, I just had a phone call from one of our students who complimented us for our tuition cut, which is not that much. It's significant, but it's not that much. Others have certainly done it. And he was telling me, that's great, I really applaud you, but I'm working with a great job as a lawyer with Price Waterhouse. I've got $220,000 of debt, 7.8 interest rate. I've had to move in with my wife, with my family. We never go out. We can't even begin to see, raising a family or buying a house, and we just don't see a way out of this. And that person, which really touched me, is the poster child for all of this. But even though he's got a great job, he's burdened by it. And then think of all the women and men who would want to go into public service or public interest jobs or work on Capitol Hill, but they have to find some other job, maybe outside of the law, where they can pay off the debt. So I mentioned that. It's a little bit of a commercial for this hobby horse idea that we all should be attacking the cost of higher education, but I think that's a big factor. It's not what you expected. With respect to jobs and the entire, and this was for, I was on the other end of this for many, many years. I was the head of hiring. The law firm hiring process, the bureaucratic systems that were set up were stupid and never made any sense anyway. They really didn't work. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying, and there are probably exceptions. They only work in flush times, when it doesn't matter, when you can take the Normandy Beach approach to hiring. We'll hire 60 people, and we'll throw them at the cliffs, and maybe after 7 or 8 years, one will make it up to the top, And there's just the whole concept of, you sort of randomly or not randomly maybe get an interview with a particular firm or not. The firms aren't sending, in most cases, the person, that they're sending people they don't mind, they're not too worried if they miss Thursday morning in the office or in the courtroom. The whole system, the crazy two-step minuet, it's very quaint, some on-campus interviews, some associate position, that was busted and never fixed. So we've got to move out and find ways to connect students on a one-on-one basis. Now, the good news is that's happening, at least in the New York area, I'm sure Anthony's Crowell for New York Law School is here. I see him, Dean there, is feeling this. But in the compliance field and in many other fields, they're finding our students. They're finding them on LinkedIn. They're hiring, recruiting people to go out and find them. So it's not really, we help them prepare for interviews, we give them information and so on, but so there's new systems. And I think we need to be very, very open in terms of finding jobs. And if we connect people with things they want to do, then they're going to be successful. This idea of having to go to a job for a couple of years that you know you're not going to like, that's always a fool's errand.
So this relates nicely to a report that everyone here should have gotten. If not, we'll make sure to follow up, which was roundtable on the new normal and challenges for legal education. A number of the people here were part of that. We had one of our grads who's now the head of HR at JBS, a large beef producer, who said, listen, for us who weren't in the top 20% of the class, the old normal was always the new normal for us. So the new normal is not new. We had to hustle really hard back then. Now it's just going through everybody in the class. And the idea is, and this is again something that Nick adverted earlier, the good upside of where we are, that large law firms aren't hiring as much as they once were, is just creating space for people to find jobs they're going to be excited about. And that's one thing that Chris talked about, how much he was passionate about his current job. Kelly, how are you taking that challenge on board in terms of finding what makes people successful and helping people find alternative paths?
Sure. Well, one of the things that our law school's always experienced is that our students do go into a fairly wide variety of work, with the, Gates Foundation and health law being so important in Seattle, and also the tech sector, Boeing and, aerospace, et cetera. We've always had, a lot of people in business and policy and health and tech, as well as in more, the traditional practice of law. But one of the things we really realized is that in some ways those people were finding their way to that without a lot of our assistance. As I think, I'm sorry I missed the earlier comment, but it sounds like Dean Moffat talked a little bit about the dissatisfaction that comes from getting in the wrong track. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to make much more transparent at the very start of the student's career. We do a fairly extensive, almost 2-week orientation program, starting right then in the first year all the way through, helping students see the different ways that people use law in their career. And right now, what the main tool for it is a website called Becoming a Lawyer, and it sort of highlights the different 3 A's that was mentioned earlier, that the people use law in different ways, and it goes. I think it does a nice job because it helps students see it. It's more than just saying, well, I think I want to be in environmental law. Well, it helps them see, what does it mean if you're in environmental law? What are the different ways you can use that, and how do your personal values and what you like to do every day, how does it fit in with what lawyers in that field do? And so it really asks the student to do that self-reflection, but it just makes it all so much more transparent. So they have a really good tool to use to try and start to form that professional identity and to think about what they want to become. And then what we've tried to do is just to have in the law school as many examples we can of people using law in all these ways, so that and I do these dean's lunches where I have somebody come and as my guest, and we invite 20 students who want to learn about that area, and we have lunch and they talk about it. We just try and think of every way we can to kind of open those windows into those different pathways, and then help our students find them. And I think it's again, there's been a lot of that over the years, but I think now it's just more intentional, and I think the students are finding it much more hopeful as they work their way through school.
Well, we have a successful alum who, when he was here in the mid-90s, had some ideas about going to work in the government, and the Career Services Office literally said, oh, you don't want to go work at a law firm? We can't help you.
Yeah.
Right? That was the old normal.
Yeah, it was the old normal. And it was also the old normal that was just such a deep trench that, even students who thought they might not want to do it, it was like this pulling, as if that was the only thing they were supposed to do. And that's what I've heard from so many students, that they just felt that. And then it was some time later that they realized, wait, there were other possibilities. And it's not that I don't want to be a lawyer, it's that I don't want to be that kind of lawyer. And this is what I am going to really find satisfaction from, because I agree with what Nick said. If you don't find something you love to do, if you can find that and do it with all your heart, the rest works out. But finding that fit is really the critical piece.
Trish?
I'm going to take the occasion to say something a little different.
Go for it.
And that is that, and this is to go back to what George started with at the very beginning when he talked about how often it's so difficult to articulate the problem. That becomes the centrally difficult thing. And I'm struck today by all of the wonderful ideas that have come out in terms of thinking about the different ways that we can train lawyers, that many of us are training lawyers. I mean, I think law schools are being extraordinarily innovative across the board, really, and this is all to the good. And all of those efforts should be applauded. But there really is a fundamental problem, and I think that to try to articulate that problem is the challenge that underlies all of this, and that is that the funding of higher education is broken. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some schools that have sufficient funds and they're not overcharging their students, but basically we're in a world where higher education is very expensive. The states have very much cut back on it, so private education is not that different from public education anymore. Students have largely borrowed except in a very few kinds of institutions. Mostly they've largely borrowed. We all know about the bubble that's there in terms of their borrowing. The job market is, as we've all talked about, changing in lots of ways. And all of these wonderful new possible opportunities and things for lawyers to do are not things that are going to make most of them wealthy. And so as the profession is changing, and as the kinds of opportunities for lawyers are changing, and as the bringing together of all of these subjects and capacities and competencies are creating new opportunities, it doesn't change what I think is the fundamental problem, and that is we need to figure out different ways to fund higher education. And there are only a couple of ways that can be done, and that's what is going to require serious, creative, innovative kinds of work. We can't do it by increasing tuition. We can't do it by just offering the same more products to the same indebted group of people, which is often what schools do. They say, oh, let me offer this new degree, and the same people have to pay for them by borrowing again. So it's not changing the fundamental difficulty. I believe that we need to be thinking that the challenge of our times for education, in particular legal education, is in the vanguard, because we're a form of graduate education where people pay for it themselves. It's not supported the way PhD programs are supported. I believe that we need to be thinking of public-private collaborations which bring in additional sources of money that are not just gift monies, because you can't run an institution on gifts over the long haul, and that's really what we need to be doing. It's the other leg, Phil, of how our law school is going to continue to be able to do these wonderful things that we're all geared up to do, we all want to do. It's expensive, and every new program is expensive, and every old program still continues, and you can't get rid of all of them. Get rid of
Trish,
some
you're
of
so
them.
right. Could I have a piece of this?
Actually, before you go, you've opened the door of this. Trish has gone. Dan is at the center. Again, he's overseeing the AALS. He's thought hard. So
That's
it. So sorry. Before Nick, you jump in, I want to hear Dan on this point.
I had an alum recently. We were honoring him, and he pointed to me and said, "He's the president of all law schools." I said, "Oh." Not exactly.
You could say dean of all deans.
Yeah. I mean, I just went on that. I thought Trish's comments in this regard are profound, as were Nick's. I want to entirely associate myself with them and say from the vantage point, first, just briefly about Northwestern, from the vantage point of a school that to use an economic lingo, is among law schools that have proven relatively, and I emphasize the relatively, inelastic with respect to demand. Nonetheless, it's the responsibility, it's incumbent on all of us throughout legal education, including those who are in the so-called T14, to be as responsible to that as others. I mean, we're engaging, whether intentionally or not, in a certain form of what might be called predatory pricing. we can, a number of law schools charge these extraordinary rates of tuition. We have the war chests, again, relatively speaking. I'm talking about a cluster of law schools to double down, triple down, quadruple down on merit aid, and in the case of Yale and Stanford, actually pull out basically, here's an enormous, powerful figure, all of their financial aid out of their endowment. So in that vantage point, that society doesn't benefit, and the legal profession doesn't benefit, and the legal academy doesn't benefit from the rich getting richer, and seeing the arms race among a caliber of school, strike caliber, among a cohort of schools who can afford and invest enormous amounts in this arms race for just the reasons, again, Trish eloquently put it, and Nick did as well, is we can't continue to do that. From the vantage point of the AALS, we have real challenges on our hand. We're not, for very sensible legal reasons, in the business of engaging in the kind of collaboration, cooperation about keeping down costs, nor is the ABA in that regard. So we're in a position in the kind of the not the management of law schools, but the advocacy on behalf of law schools of combating to a great extent the onslaught directed toward legal education, in not only promoting but highlighting innovation where it happens, and not only highlighting innovation, but highlighting innovation not at all costs, but highlighting efficient forms of education. So when a Nick Allard comes on, he was too modest, and announces a 15% decrease in tuition in an era where that's not required, and other law schools haven't done exactly that. A few have, but most have not. The responsibility on behalf of those of us in legal education, including the AALS, is to say, hooray, maybe to say it's about time, but to promote that kind of activity as assiduously and as honestly as we promote Harvard's development of a brand new $15 million clinic, or Yale's promotion of a new PhD program in law. And I think that's an essential and important role of the AALS, not as an accreditation organization, but an organization that's fundamentally an advocate for American law schools and thus an advocate for legal education.
Nick, aren't you glad you waited?
I was just going to say, I'm very glad I waited.
All right, Nick, weigh in.
So, just a couple of points. One, Trish, you're absolutely right, and Dan, thank you for those strong comments. It's true that law schools are pricing themselves out of business right now. If you're talking about, you're having a conference on innovation, there is no innovation that's bigger or more important, because everything else flows from it, from finding a solution to the broken financial model. It's precluding opportunity for qualified people who want to become lawyers. When they graduate, it's precluding their ability to become affordable, qualified lawyers to serve and meet unmet needs. So it's an access to justice issue. It's also contributing to the high cost of legal services, because they need to be charging, enough in order to make a living. So there's that. But there's a much larger question about where and how did America get away from investing in higher education. You can make a very good, this is Tricia's point, I believe, is that you can make a very good case that large part what made America great was our willingness and our tradition of investing in education, and not just in research, but investing and providing everybody with the opportunity to learn, use their minds, and advance. And we've gotten away from that. And the most recent example comes from my own party, my president, President Obama. I know most of you are probably familiar with this, but his proposal to cut back the loan forgiveness program for those people who are willing to dedicate themselves and work for at least a decade in public service, making very low pay salaries, is shameful. And it's wrong. It's wrong-headed, and it's inappropriate. And the canard that high tuition is caused by big loans is ridiculous, and they know it, okay? I hope that somebody's recording this. I smell a rat, because I think that there's folks in the private sector that want to reduce the federal lending and drive the business to the private sector, and so that's what's causing all this nonsense. But it's really unfair. You're trying to balance the federal budget on the backs of the people who are going out and willing to do, the Lord's work, serving in the underserved areas. It's ridiculous. But it's just an example of what Trish was talking about. And we have to get back. And I'll tell you, having spent years in Baghdad on the Potomac, working down there as a lobbyist. Law school and legal education is not an easy sell, so there is something we all can do collectively, which is, you heard that peroration I was starting at the beginning. We have to remind ourselves why law and lawyers matter, so that this is a worthy endeavor and it's appropriate to invest in this form of education. We're not going to be inventing the cure to cancer, but we'll maybe be helping facilitate the research, the intellectual property rights and things like that. Law has always mattered. So not a sermon, just a thought.
So one comment on this great discussion, then we'll get the audience involved. When I came in and developed a action plan, I didn't think we had time for strategic planning. We had just done it at exactly the wrong time to do a strategic plan for law schools. So basically, a few basics you might expect, which is focusing on our students getting into valuable careers, focusing on admitting the right sort of students, giving them the right sort of experience, and just like Trish said, alternative revenue, by which I don't mean raising tuition or admitting more students to train them. And yes, we did try a little bit, because this wasn't as obvious, that maybe we'd get some LLMs, but Trish is right, that's not a great market. So once you constrain what you can do, you point to the direction that Trish has, which I will tell you, among the problems we're talking about today, that is probably the hardest one. And I know Trish has some ideas on that we can continue talking about, but before doing that, let's get the audience involved. Question from a student first.
We're studying.
Otto, once
There's
again.
a student, Otto.
Thank you, Otto.
Seems to be the only student. He always asks the first question.
I wonder if you guys could comment a little bit. A lot of schools, I don't know if many law schools are doing it, but a lot of MIT, for example, I believe is broadcasting a lot of their classes online and granting access basically to the public at large to their classes. Have your schools thought of this approach, and where has that led you?
Well, if you're talking about the MOOCs device, we put up a MOOC last year, Law and the Entrepreneur. Like all such MOOCs, it came out of the box hard. 46,000 people signed up. Like other MOOCs, the completion rate was about 1%, which let me tell you was the best in the university. So that may be the intermediate term with respect to these massive online open courses. We'll probably do more of that. It helps the brand. It's also longer topic, but it's morphed in some respects into a real sort of a interesting form of combat among some key companies. Some you've heard of, like Coursera, others you probably haven't heard of, and I think it'll be very interesting the next 36 months about how the shakeout will be in the ed tech environment. Law schools will lag, probably always will lag behind their counterparts in business and in computer science and in others, but it's got our attention, and I think it's gotten the attention of some other schools about how best to kind of mobilize the energies and efforts of our faculty to push out content, probably for selfish reasons, to promote the brand of the school, but in ways that may be beneficial, particularly for folks who can't afford a legal education and folks overseas.
Great. Yeah, Mike.
Ours does.
Kelly, go for it.
I love this question because I'm going to be very frank with you. Most days, as much as I'm proud of some of the things we're doing, I don't think we're really innovating all that much because everybody's innovating sort of within a box. And I think it's really hard. I remember the Audre Lorde saying that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And I wonder if we're not, really there. I mean, I think that as much as these are improvements, like I love a lot of the things I hear that we're doing. I love a lot of the things I hear other people are doing. I think they're improvements. But are those really going to reset some of the major issues we're all talking about? I don't know that I think that, honestly. And likewise, these issues of finance, and I completely agree with all my colleagues that is the issue of the day. When we can't even get people to come together to pay for roads to be patched anymore, that's not something we should fund, publicly. We've got a, really huge uphill battle here. So I guess I want to say that, I think one of the real questions is that if we are innovating, then there won't be this weird situation where people are saying too many lawyers and meanwhile most of the world goes without representation. That would be one of the things I would think that we would actually start to close that gap, and that our courts and our systems of law would have the respect that a lot of us hold for them, but I don't think that's as widely shared as it needs to be. People don't generally understand the infrastructure creating role that law plays for society. They understand law as dispute, or advice, but the way a society, differs, where there is the rule of law and where there's not, that's not widely understood. That's what I'd like to see one of these big courses on, right? We could get people to really take it. So great question, and I guess I want to just be really frank in saying that I think you've asked a really, really important question.
Let me answer it also, Mike, and frame what I had as another question that maybe people will jump in, or we can just leave it, which is, one answer to the question is, you look at what's the law school's core asset. It's the faculty. Right? So all faculty members are generally collectively, and I would include every faculty member on this, the biggest expense any law school has in their books. The second would be, per what Dan said, probably financial aid for most schools. Aid. Right? So let's look at the first, faculty. So the way you'd have a litmus test is, are faculty members energized, inspired, empowered, and supported for them to be innovative along the critical dimensions? So on, what it's developing a MOOC, developing a source of alternative revenue, figuring out what are the admitted students who you want via interview or some other, or helping people find really great skill sets or capabilities to get them careers. So that would be the way I would want to assess the level of innovation in school, which is, has it taken root with the faculty, and are they empowered and inspired doing the sorts of things that Trish related? The follow-on question is, how do you do that? Because if that's what's important, then the question is, okay, how do you do that? And that probably, even more than raising alternative revenue, may be the hardest parts of a dean's job, because the truth is, deans don't have a lot of power over faculty. Fred Kahn, who's a real hero of mine, was at this table, and he said, a dean to a faculty is kind of like a hydrant to a dog. And for those who knew Fred, you appreciate the colorful metaphor and what a great guy he is.
Sometimes, like being a funeral director, you got a lot of people under you, but nobody's listening.
So, Trish, you want to take a whack at this? How do you, like, obviously you had this situation where someone came to you and you're able to work them. That's huge, because not a lot of deans would do that. But how do you go a step further and say, anyone else who wants to do stuff like this, I want to actively encourage you, and then actually see that reverberate?
How you do that?
Yeah, I was going to give Trish the first one, but if you want to take her off the hook, I'm sure she'd be.
Well, no, I'd probably get in trouble, because I would say that my faculty was ready for change. And
pick your predecessor well. Is that
yeah? I won't go any further. Well, you said it, but and also the fact that they were willing to take me. I mean, you're talking about risky innovations, and unlike Groucho Marx, if that club wanted me, I wanted them, because it's actually meant something that they were open to that. But they've been extremely supportive. They don't agree with everything. Our process has been. They've been very engaged, but in a largely constructive way, and it's been iterative. But one of the big changes is, we take it in, we make improvements. We've changed our writing program. We have a 2-year JD option, all these other things. But they all are strengthened from their comments. But this is the big change. This is like, headline news. But we will make a decision. The 2-year JD was considered over 14 months, constant meetings. But there is a point, like Robert Rules of Order. By the way, we are going to make a decision, right? There will be a vote on it. You can reject it. Here's why I do it. But they've been very supportive, and they've really rolled up their sleeves. So I think they were ready. I didn't have anything to do with it. But it is true that if you start doing some of these things, then they get engaged, and it gives you some momentum. So it's worth trying.
Trish?
Well, institutions are very difficult to turn on a dime, and faculties in particular are very difficult to turn on a dime. And so part of what you have to do, and then institutions within bigger universities become even more complicated, and deans who have to deal with the central processes of their universities are constrained, each of us in different ways, by different odd things. So you have to make choices, very strategic choices, as to what you can do without, what you can do by, this is going to sound terrible, by imposition, and what's going to become democratic. Because things that are done democratically don't happen quickly, just by definition. But there are certain kinds of things which clearly have to be done democratically. But then there are lots of other things that you have to do really with, assuming not that one person's doing it, but by people that you're working with closely, and then just doing it. And that's a very tricky line to draw as to what needs to be done by the group, and what by a committee of the whole, and what basically can just be done administratively. I do not think that institutions can change unless there's a great deal that's done administratively, though. I mean, I've come very much to believe that. Now, just to add a little bit of light humor to the story, I was looking at my email today, and this shows, the depth and importance of my position. 3 of my faculty members, all tenured, whose office shares whose 3 offices are next to each other, but share a single thermostat, cannot agree on the temperature. And so this is a major war between the 3. So I just want you to know that, our jobs go in ways you wouldn't describe.
Well, and for book recommendations, we've had a few of them today. We had Bill Urey here earlier this week talking about getting to yes 30 years later. That literally is a case out of getting to yes. And the challenge is, how do you reframe the issue and come up with a way to, meet the respective interests?
You asked them to give up their offices.
Two quick things. Some of you, this may be a little inside baseball, but many of the innovations that developed over the last many years were the product of an extraordinarily powerful dean, a guy by the name of David Van Zandt, who ruled with an iron fist over Northwestern for a decade and a half with I guess they say shock and awe, sometimes more shock, sometimes more awe. And he beat down the faculty and drew upon the support of a very sympathetic and equally powerful president to push through changes, work experience, development of teamwork capacity, JD MBA program, et cetera. He just did it, and we're the beneficiary of some of these key innovations. I'm also inherited, though, a faculty that was used to being beaten down with respect to these initiatives. And 2 years into the job, I think it's still too soon to tell whether a different kind of style, my style, is going to bear fruit. It sure as hell helps to bring in almost $100 million over the course of 2 years, if I may pat myself on the back, my and other, because there's a serious point in that, other than the commercial on my behalf, is if you don't make the decision zero sum. If you see them nested in, we're going to promote innovation, and we're going to bring in the money to do it. Now, a couple years from now, it's going to be, what have you done for us lately? So this is an optimistic story in chapter 6 of a 9-chapter story. But I really think that developing external resources, along with being hopefully an inspiration for change and developing ideas and making convincing cases, is in the long run a better strategy for law schools than shock and awe. As valuable as that was during a very critical era for Northwestern.
So, as I said earlier, this is meant to continue to develop a conversation and a network. Those of you who can stay with us a little longer, please join us for that conversation next door over a cocktail, and continue to tease out these themes, talk to any of the panels today, talk to the folks here from Colorado Law. This has really been very valuable for me, and look forward to keeping forward. Thank you, my fellow deans, for a wonderful way to bring it to a close.
Oh, God.
By seniors? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we saw each other. Yeah. Congratulations. Thank you.